Bonjour tout le monde. It's a pleasure to be here, and I really, again, I think everybody's expressed gratitude, and I will as well, to the Gen D team and to the Collège de France for this opportunity. For me, it's really exciting not only to speak to all of you, but to be together with a group of scholars that have been assembled for today and to talk about synergies between our work. It is true I am no longer the director of the Eli Coleman Institute for Sexual and Gender Health. You may have noticed some political turmoil happening in the United States that's made the situation there unsafe for members of my family, and we've returned to Canada. So, but it's my most recent affiliation, and I maintain an affiliation there. I'm just no longer the director. But I want to talk to you today, and I feel like Seth and I were just saying this is like we're kind of the odd ones out here because we're both going to be talking theory and we're talking about things that maybe are puzzle pieces that don't fit perfectly neatly. I'm waiting for Pierre-Yves to say, what about resources? Where does the economics fit into what I'm talking about? Because what I'm talking about here is a little bit more individual level, a little bit more interpersonal. It ties into the kinds of research that we see on stigma and discrimination and some of the holes in the theory there, and some of my own frustrations as we do this kind of work. And so we haven't talked a lot about stigma and discrimination. We've talked about these socio-structural determinants like socioeconomic status, jobs, all of these kind of things. And so I did not bring a big background on this. But what I want to say is kind of where this is coming from. It's coming from my own frustrations with that body of literature that's on discrimination and stigma that focuses very much on interpersonal discrimination and stigma and a little bit on structural. And as an epidemiologist, and I started as a molecular epidemiologist, not a social epidemiologist, doing viral genetics with HIV transmission. But as you know, these problems in that world will not be solved by biological advancements alone, because even if we had that, uptake and use and all of that is so socially determined that I became more of a social epidemiologist. And I think the majority of my work still is on trans and non-binary health, but a huge and substantial 20-year thread of it has been on methodologies in how we study social marginalization specifically. And in doing so, I find that I'm often trying to make the methods match existing theory. Because people will have a really good theory, they'll do an analysis, they'll gather data, they'll do an analysis, they'll get an answer that doesn't exactly answer the question that they were asking. And so there's this mismatch. And as I've gone about doing that, I focused on sampling, I focused on statistical analysis methods, I focused on conceptualizations, causal theory, we can talk about that more. But sometimes those areas are just under-theorized. And so what I'm talking about now is some new work that's more theoretical. You'll be the first people I will have presented this to publicly, so I'm hoping for good questions and critiques, and I may not have all the answers, but I will go away and think about it. And so in a sense today, I'm an epidemiologist masquerading as a sociologist, and I hope the more legitimate sociologists in the room will be gentle about that. So we have a substantial body of research evidence that shows that social marginalization, including discrimination and stigma, and I always put those together. Some people use enacted stigma as a synonym for discrimination. I think it's a weaker formulation. But we have a substantial body of evidence that these impact physical and mental health, as well as access to healthcare, the timeliness of that, who gets access, and what the outcomes are. And so what I want to ask is, what about privilege? And I'll tell you why as we move forward. So in general, when we have quantitative researchers who are measuring discrimination, we measure it in different ways. We may measure major discrimination. These are these kind of human rights violations around employment and housing or violence or things like this that impact people's lives. We also measure day-to-day discrimination. These are the microaggressions, if you know Daryl Wing Sue's work, or the day-to-day kind of indignities that people experience that can accumulate to really affect their well-being in different ways. We may measure anticipated discrimination because One's expectation of discrimination impacts their avoidance of healthcare systems, for example. We see that a lot within trans communities, even in emergency medical situations, that 20% may avoid going to the emergency department in a potential medical emergency because of that anticipation. And some people measure internalized stigma as well. I try to do this more broadly, that is so individual to different social positions and identities, the ways that that stigma is incorporated. So we may try to also measure, instead of general measures, specific types. We might look at HIV-related stigma. We might look at gendered racial microaggressions, because we know that racism is gendered, sexism is racialized. And I could give a long list here of specific types of discrimination or stigma that researchers have tried to measure in their work and have analyzed with regard to its relation to health and well-being. So I'd ask, why is there no similar suite of measures on privilege? Is privilege merely the absence of stigma and discrimination? And privilege, despite being talked about in general socially, is rarely operationalized within research. And if you look at the research that does exist, is somebody going to give me time? I realized I brought this little timer up because I want to be respectful to other people's time. Well, I'm going to start it. It'll be approximate.
Raise my hand when you still have 5 minutes.
Perfect. Okay. So why is there? So if we look at the literature that exists, people don't necessarily say it, but this is essentially what they're doing. They're trying to measure stigma and discrimination on some kind of a metric scale. And in general, they're assuming that the lack of that discrimination is implicitly, by default, is privilege. And that's true, but that's a very, very partial answer to this question. And it's not a particularly problematic kind of privilege in that there's nothing wrong with not being discriminated against. In fact, it's what we would hope for all of us. The problem comes in sometimes when people who experience that don't recognize that everybody else is not getting the fair and just treatment that they're getting. So it's not a problem for people to experience this type of privilege. There's nothing that they need to do about it other than to be cognizant of the systems that produce that for some people and not for others. But is this really a fulsome understanding of how we want to look at privilege? And are there ways that privilege may impact health that go beyond merely not being discriminated against? And if we look at the way that privilege is talked about, in popular discussions, it's often around who holds different types of privileges. Are they aware that they hold particular privileges? Does somebody have more privileges? Should they be aware of that? Should they check their privilege? And of course, people should be aware of privilege. But I think a more interesting question for us is, how does privilege function? And how does it function in different ways to shape the opportunities that are opened up to different individuals, to constrain the possibilities for their lives as they move forward, to impact their health and their well-being physically, mentally, socially, sexually, in all the ways that make life more or less worthwhile for us. And so I started asking, okay, how does privilege function? It's more than just the absence of stigma and discrimination. And I was fortunate to be asked to contribute a chapter to this book that was conveniently titled Power, Privilege, and Public Health in the United States, and this just came out in March. So you'll find me at chapter 6 on privilege and intersectionality frameworks in public health. And I don't think I was the worst offender, but I was one of the last people to turn in my chapter. Because I was saying, no, wait, I have this 4-dimensional model. No, wait, I have a 5-dimensional model. I have a 6-dimensional model. No, I have a 7-dimensional model of privilege. Because the more I thought about it, the more I recognized different ways. And I still don't consider this finished. I'm pretty sure this is not in any way a complete model. It's just the more I thought about it, and the more I read, and the more people I talked to, the more I kept identifying different ways that privilege functions. So what I want to do is share some of them with you today. And when we look at academic work on privilege, it's often focused on kind of single access privilege, white privilege, heterosexual privilege, male privilege, things like that. And some of the earlier work that I think is still important, and certainly was very popularized, was Peggy McIntosh's work in 1989 from a paper called White Privilege: Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And in this work, she conceptualizes privilege as an invisible and weightless knapsack that white people carry with ourselves throughout the day. We don't know it's there unless we're told. We don't feel it. But it contains a lot of tools that we can use we may not be aware of. She says it contains special provisions to nourish us, maps to show us where to go, passports to allow access to spaces that others may not be able to access, code books to make sense of things, visas, clothes, tools, and blank checks, these kind of racialized resources that are invisibilized. And so it was a powerful piece in that way, and in that she called for the development of a greater taxonomy of privilege. And there's a bit of work that's been done on that and on theorization. In fact, the book that I just introduced was really formed around Stephanie Nixon's conceptualization of the coin theory of privilege, where she sees privilege as structural, like a coin, and it's got two sides that are part and parcel of the same thing. The way that privilege and oppression are both part of the same thing. You can't have one without the other in her model. I didn't find that a particularly strong model to have a lot of explanatory potential to help us understand how privilege functions, which was the question I had. Its main point is that these come together and they're structural. That's not enough to help us understand how it functions. So in my chapter, I really worked on that. But I started from McIntosh. So she gives 2 of those 7 dimensions I'm going to talk about. The first I've already identified for you. It's that lack of stigma and discrimination. And I'm going to just call that just and fair experiences. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. But she identifies a second one. And that's allowed harmful ignorance. And that one, on the other hand, is not something that should be just allowed. It's not something that's harmless. In fact, it harms the one who holds those views, and it harms people who are subjected to them. So, for example, one could go through the world with the idea that the only advanced civilizations that contributed anything worthy in academia or art were European, ignoring, prioritizing the Romans, ignoring the Incas, ignoring all of the Central, South American, Chinese, Indian, African societies that also, Middle Eastern, that also built astronomy and mathematics and art and culture and all of these things. And that is not a harmless view in the sense that it will obscure contributions of other peoples, it will contribute to racism and to cultural supremacy and to imperialism. And so she identifies these 2. She's talking about white privilege. And so I'm going to put up an image that I'm just going to leave out for a while as I talk about it. And this is in the book, but I also put it under a Creative Commons license so everybody can use it. They were confused by that, but I thought, why don't I just do that first? So you see those first 2 there, and kind of what I want to show is that the other side isn't necessarily discrimination. Being subjected to ignorance isn't necessarily discrimination. The one after it, stagnation, is not necessarily discrimination. So the absence of this is not equivalent to stigma and discrimination. It's something different. But I'm less focused on that right side. I just kind of wanted to show what happens in the absence, more focused on the left here. So the third one I'm calling promotion and facilitation, and this is kind of what started me thinking. The university, when I was at Western University in Canada, where I still have an adjunct appointment, they do amazing leadership trainings, and I was in one because I was in a leadership role. And we were on Zoom because it was the pandemic, and one of the men on the call just said, I think we all kind of got here the same way, right? Just one day we were going about our business and somebody tapped us on the shoulder and said, hey, I think you'd be a good fit for this leadership position. Yeah, I saw a couple people nod and a couple people look confused. I was thinking, that's not how I got there. But that's promotion and facilitation, right? It's a different thing than not being discriminated against. It's the forces that lubricate your advancement in life, that pull you forward, that open up opportunities for you. And those can be interpersonal or they can be structural. And in fact, all of these can be interpersonal or they can be structural, and I'm going to give you some examples in a bit on that. So promotion and facilitation, I thought, well, that's something that's a little bit different than absence of stigma and discrimination. It's an active force that lubricates your advancement. And in the absence of that, people will end up stagnated, in comparison to people with similar skills, similar training, and similar aptitudes. So then as I was thinking, as I said, I thought, well, what about meaning? Sometimes it feels like I have to explain things forever. And as somebody who develops a lot of survey measures, I know that, with the work that I do in the communities that I work with, the way that we measure things is often geared into a particular, very mainstream cultural understanding. So for my Indigenous colleagues who don't separate out sexual orientation and gender identity in their conceptualizations of two-spirit or other specific types of sexual gender identity, for them, sexuality and gender are not separable in that way, and in fact, often those roles are linked to ceremonial status and role in community more than they are to something like identity. Identity might be almost meaningless, but it's about your place in community and the roles that you play, and that's a gendered thing in a lot of cultures. And so, my Indigenous colleagues had said when we were working on some of these questions, well, we can adapt them, we can try to make them so that Western people can answer these questions, but we need to be able to place ourselves as well. But it's more work. It's more work. So implicitly understood meaning, that's the privilege you have when you can look at a survey item and there are answers that fit you. It's the privilege you have when you can mention the name of one of your holidays and everybody knows what it is. Maybe even you have a paid day off of work for it. It's the privilege that comes with writing an application essay and having 500 words and not having to waste 200 of them explaining something about your culture that not everybody else is going to understand, and having the full space to build up your strengths and to have a stronger application as a result. That's the privilege of implicitly understood meaning. And I'm not saying everybody needs to know everything about every culture and every sexual orientation to everybody's situation. As multicultural societies, we expect we're all going to do some communication around differences, but that burden can fall very heavily on specific groups of people in different cultures. And not having that burden is itself a privilege. The next one is respect for autonomy and integrity. And I came to this by thinking about violence, but not just violence, but physical invasiveness, invading other people's space, touching parts of their body without permission. It happens to people with pregnant bellies get touched without permission. People with black hair get their hair touched without permission. There's a lot of lack of respect, and this comes out in policy ways as well. Do you need spousal permission to have a reproductive surgery that's going to change your fertility, or is that a decision that you're allowed to make autonomously? So these are respect for autonomy and for bodily integrity as a privilege. The sixth one I take and expand on from a paper by Tuck and Yang, but they actually take this idea from Janet Mawhinney's PhD thesis years earlier. But the paper is called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And it includes, as part of that paper, this idea of moves to innocence. And these are the moves that non-Indigenous people make in order to relieve themselves of guilt. So that could be nebulous claims to Indigenous ancestry. If you're in Quebec in Canada, suddenly everybody has Indigenous ancestry. And maybe they do. Maybe they do have a great-great-grandparent, but that doesn't mean that they're somehow free of responsibility for dealing with colonization. So moves to innocence are those moves that people make to try to get themselves off the hook, and they could be by making claims. So I expanded this. So, somebody who says, oh, I can't be a racist, my husband's black. Or I can't be this for this reason. Or structurally, we might cite our DEI programs, our diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, and say, well, we're on the good side of this. And there are certainly DEI initiatives I've seen that are very solid, substantial initiatives, and there are others that I'm pretty sure just serve as an institutional move to move to innocence, to say, look, we're doing something here. See, look, we've got this thing over here. Don't critique us, we're fine. So that's a form of privilege, being able to make a successful move to innocence. And lastly, I put assumed good intentions, or the pressure to assume, pressure placed on others to assume your good intentions. And again, that can be institutional. I'm sure that doctor didn't mean to do that, disgraceful, disrespectful thing to you, when you go to try to file a complaint with a licensing board. Or it can be interpersonal. You need to cut them some slack. They're coming from a good place. They're just not educated, whatever. And it allows people to get off the hook for all of these other things that are on this list. because we're supposed to assume good intentions. And I'm not saying nobody has good intentions. I'm saying that it's a form of privilege when people will assume your good intentions or pressure others to assume your good intentions as a way of not holding you accountable for the things that you do. So privilege also functions to relieve people of responsibility for harms that they may do. So this is the model that I came up with. And here, as promised, is just examples for interpersonal and structural. I tried to say some of these so we don't have to go through all of them right now. But I just want to make the claim here that each of these can be enacted in interpersonal situations. You cannot be followed by a suspicious shop owner while you're shopping. That, again, everybody should not be followed while they're shopping and not shoplifting. At a structural level, though, you could have the privilege of not having an automated resume reviewer exclude your application for having a perfectly appropriate but foreign education. Allowed harmful ignorance, I talked about that, but that can be institutionalized in textbooks that talk about Indigenous people only in the past tense and don't acknowledge living peoples and living cultures and paint the picture that either people are disappeared or they're disappearing, and the expectation is that they will disappear or be totally amalgamated into other cultures. Promotion and facilitation, I mentioned that being considered, put forward for a leadership position you weren't looking for, but at an institutional level, you could also receive preferred admission status because of legacy admissions if your parents went there. So that privilege of having parents with that education gets passed on to you institutionally. So I'm not going to read through all of these, but each of these can be enacted in interpersonal and in institutional contexts. So now, what does this mean for privilege? So Peggy McIntosh was writing about white privilege. We talk about male privilege, heterosexual privilege, all of these things. But each of these is, again, a single-axis form of privilege. It's considering them one at a time as though they don't interact with each other, so they don't work together. We know that for most people, their lives are not lived out at exclusively marginalized positions or at exclusively privileged positions. So for most people, they're experiencing some combinations. And in Canada, a common way of kind of showing this are these wheels of power and privilege. And this one was developed by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, Institute of Gender and Health. That's why the sex and gender parts of the wheel are kind of popped out visually. We also licensed this under a Creative Commons license, so you can also use this if you like it or adapt it. And this shows power at the center of the wheel and more marginalized positions at the margins, right? And then it shows those processes. One thing I like about this one is it shows those processes around the outside that create those kind of differentials. And we could build on it. We could add fatness or body size. We could add caste. There's a lot of things that we could add in different contexts. You'll see that this is Canadian because English and French are the power languages and other languages are not. That's going to be different. Of course, they're the official languages in Canada. If you come with those, then you can access all the government information and forms and processes in schools and all of the things that then allow you access to the others. So what I'm saying here already, as you can see, is having this one form of power and privilege around language allows you to potentially access the one around education, which may allow you, if you're not a member of a group that experiences a large amount of employment discrimination, that may then lead to additional privilege in the employment context. So these are not independent. And when we published this, it was part of a little sheet called Meet the Methods. I was holding a sex and gender science chair in Canada that was funded, and for each of us, they were doing these methods sheets around our work. And I said, we need to put in there that this is not intersectional or people will be confused because they confuse multiple marginalizations with intersectionality. The fact that you're looking at all of these in no way makes your work intersectional. It's a multiple marginalization approach. So we put that in that little document as well, just to make it's really extra clear. But what we can do with this is we can look at what I've just given you on privilege, we can look at what we know about discrimination and about social power, and we could apply that to any slice of this particular wheel. We can say, okay, how does it function? How might people have implicitly understood meanings around some of these things? And you can look at religion and say, okay, well, some religions are more institutionalized in different countries and contexts, and others are not. So we could look at any of these, and we could take that gradient that I just gave you around privilege, and we could try to apply it to any slice in this particular wheel. And now we're kind of bringing that together, but we're not done yet. We're just bringing it together in a multiple marginalization kind of context. So can each marginalization or privilege, can power, could this really be understood as its own independent gradient? I think I've already hinted to you that I don't think that it can. And so when I wrote this chapter, I wanted to really bring intersectionality into it, especially a couple of ideas from Patricia Hill Collins that I thought were very relevant to this area of work. And I also wanted to give some teaching tools for people to use to help understand it better. So I want to share a couple of those with you. And intersectionality, we've already talked about it a bit. People often reference Kimberly Crenshaw, the American legal scholar who first introduced the word into the academic world, though it existed in Black feminist community before that, specifically lesbian Marxist Black feminist communities, but also in other communities in the US. So Kimberly Crenshaw, she's got a particular way of talking about intersectionality as a legal scholar with legal cases and the civil rights protections that are not necessarily meted out appropriately when one has to file a complaint only under one single ground at a time. My work, and I think a lot of our work in health, is better suited to drawing more heavily on Patricia Hill Collins' work, the sociologist, and so I'll be doing that. And they write about intersectionality as a traveling theory. In the sense that it travels through geography, it travels through disciplines. This is Edward Said's idea of traveling theories. It travels through disciplines and geographies, and as it does, two things happen. It's changed by its travels, and it changes the areas that it travels through. And so my concern as an epidemiologist when I saw intersectionality enter epidemiology was that it would be flattened of all meaning. Because I'd kind of watched that happen with syndemics. When syndemics came out of anthropology and into public health and epidemiology, suddenly, and that was through the work of Ron Stahl, and nothing against Ron Stahl, but people just read Ron Stahl. They didn't go back to Meryl Singer's original work, and they missed a lot of the most interesting work on syndemics, and especially they missed the connection to power. And that's part of what got lost. And so when I saw intersectionality, which I was familiar with, enter epidemiology, I said, oh no, we have to maintain some integrity to this as it travels through my field. I'm responsible. So that was the genesis for my first 2014 paper on intersectionality. I was on sabbatical and I could read Black feminist theory and statistics books back to back at the same time, back and forth, and epidemiology texts, and yay for sabbaticals, because it's hard to have the time to do that kind of new thinking sometimes. More recently, not the most recent, I think I have 13 or 14 papers now on intersectionality methods and quantitative research. But if you want to know what the field looks like, I'll just direct you to this pair of systematic reviews published in SSM Population Health the same year. One is from my research group, one is from Paul Wesson's group at University of California, San Francisco. We realized we were working on them at the same time. And I love the collaboration in this field. I attended some of his research team meetings, he attended some of mine. We decided they were different enough to go forward with two systematic reviews and not merge them. We planned it out so that that would be the case, and I think we were successful publishing in the same journal in the same year. So they complement each other. Theirs is a little narrower and deeper than ours. But it just kind of gives you a picture of what's going on, in health. Theirs is health research. Mine is across all fields, and what's going on in quantitative research and intersectionality. In some ways, it's bad news in the sense that there is a lot of work that doesn't even define intersectionality. Some gives very poor definitions or understandings. There's a lack of engagement with the methods literature that does exist. There's an awful lot of room for improvement. So that's why we're here. And as I've been teaching about this, again, I'm drawing heavily on Patricia Hill Collins, and specifically the 6 core ideas of intersectionality, and I'm going to talk about the 2 in blue. I think we've been talking already, social inequality, inequities, unjust inequalities, we're talking about that all day. Social power, social context, social justice, we've hit on all of these today. Relationality and complexity, which has a specific meaning, less so we're going to focus there. Relationality is one of the ideas that's most impacted my work and my approach to methods, and I really recommend this book. This is Intersectionality as Critical Social Theory, 2019. It's a brilliant book, and it has an entire chapter on relationality. And one thing that I love about Patricia Hill Collins' work is that she gives us thinking tools. She says, here are some tools to use, here are ways to ask questions. And so she says for relationality, it's how these different forms of stigma and discrimination, and I'm going to add privilege here, how these come together in different ways. And she said we can think about this 3 ways. We can think about addition. And addition is when we're adding categories to pre-existing areas of inquiry. So we're a scholar of gender inequity, and now we're going to add into there what we know about heteronormativity, and we're going to look at heteropatriarchy. It forms a new idea that's different from those others, because when you bring those together, it's something different. So in addition, we can ask ourselves, I'm a scholar who works in this area, what happens when I bring this other thing into my work? What happens when I look at how my work on employment equity how that is racialized? What happens when I look at how my disability communities, when I want to look at, how immigration status impacts those communities and living with disabilities? So we can do addition. She says, well, you can also look at articulation. And she uses this metaphor of like a truck trailer, a large truck where the front and the back are joined together. And once they move differently than when they're separate. And we can study how things move differently when they're joined together. I think of it as a joint like a hip joint, and maybe that's because I come from a biological background. But the fact is, when you have something that's joined, and it can't be separated, but it's individual pieces, it articulates, it moves. And it moves differently when it's joined together, depending on how it's joined together. So we can study this process. And this is part of what I'm talking about when I say we need to understand how privilege works, how it moves. How does privilege move, particular privilege, when you join it with a particular type of stigma? Or when you join it with another type of privilege, how does that function differently? And then she says sometimes we have co-formation. And this says that sometimes when things come together, we can't actually study them separately anymore. They become something totally different. They become something co-formed that can't be divided into their parts. And for this, I always go to this paper that Lisa Bolig wrote. It's a qualitative paper on gay and bisexual Black men in the United States. And one of her participants says, well, it's hard for me to separate my identities. Once you've blended the cake, you can't take the parts back to the main ingredients. That's co-formation. And yet we're here and I'm saying, I'm a scholar of sugar, you're a scholar of flour, you study chocolate, you study eggs, let's get together and we'll understand cake. It doesn't work like that, right? Once it's baked together. And sometimes I extend this metaphor painfully, and I put up like a loaf of challah bread and I put up some egg noodles and they're like the same ingredients pretty much, except for the yeast. But they're made entirely differently. And we can extend that metaphor forever and say that they respond differently. Only one becomes more delicious when it's dropped in boiling water, for example. But those processes that form us, that shape us, and the ways we respond to challenges in the future are impacted by that co-formation, how we're baked together. So now let's go back to that wheel of power and privilege. This is the exercise that I gave people to think about this. We can make a sentence, we can fill in the blank. You can do this now, you can do this later. You can say to yourself, one category may mitigate the privilege or marginalization of another category in a specific context. I'm an immigrant to Canada. In fact, I applied 3 times. I found it works better with money in your bank account and a PhD than it did before. I'm rarely considered an immigrant in a Canadian context because I'm a native English speaker and I'm white. So I might say whiteness mitigates the marginalization of immigrant status in majority white countries. My experience as an immigrant is not the same as many others. And I have friends who are not treated as immigrants until they open their mouth, and then we have accent, and we have dialect, and we have language as markers of immigrant status as well, which then mitigate so the whiteness might privilege it, but once they open their mouth, now, okay, and now you're not one of us, right? And so you can put this together. You can say being gay may mitigate the privilege of being Christian in the United States. You might not experience the same kind of privileges related to being majority religious group if you're gay. And you can try this with all of these different aspects, just try it on for size. And what you're going to understand is that the ways that oppression and privilege are meted out to individuals are contextual and they're based on the other things on this wheel. And again, we could expand this wheel as well. And in the US, they like to talk about multiple identities. I was really happy today. People weren't using the identity language a lot. They were talking about social position, Because of course you don't have to identify as poor to be impacted by poverty. You don't have, it's not about identity. But a lot of the intersectionality work comes out of the US and uses that language. So we can see that these are relational in Patricia Hill Collins' sense. How they move together is different when you join them together. And we get different answers to questions when we add one to something that we're already interested in. If I'm a scholar and I'm over here on this urban-rural geography thing, I study rural health, my work is going to be very different when I start adding in other pieces of this. That's her addition kind of thought project. And if I want to look at that process of how that functions for people, that's that articulation. And if I find myself learning that to have different combinations of this makes something rather unique that we can't really subdivide, now I'm in co-formation. So relationality really helps us understand that. And then I told you I would talk about complexity as well, and I put that up for Patricia Hill Collins, but I'm going to make a sneaky jump to Leslie McCall's work. Because she has this whole paper on the complexity of intersectionality that I think is important for a question I want to move to, which is, can we study privilege? Is there other ways that we can measure it? Can we study it? Because we're not, for the most part, other than solid economic status or things like that, some of the structural things. And so Leslie McCall says we can look at intersectional complexity in 3 ways. It could be anti-categorical, intra-categorical, or inter-categorical. Anti is where we're questioning the boundaries of these categories themselves. Researchers often do this in qualitative work. Sometimes in quantitative work, there's a whole book called Indigenous Statistics that's written by Australian and Canadian Indigenous scholars that really talks about who counts and how that's often based on government policies and desires and colonial initiatives. It's not based on who's claimed as a member by different tribal groups. It's not based on all of these other ways that people could be counted that may be more relevant to different things. So even in quantitative research, we can do some of this anti-categorical work. Our work often falls in quantitative work into the intra and intercategorical complexity areas. Intracategorical is we're focusing on a specific intersection of social categories. I'm interested in studying young gay Asian men in Canada. It's a very particular intersection if I'm looking at that. And that may come together in ways that create these co-formed experiences that are different, that really produce issues and concerns and health-related impacts that are unique to the group or that are greater in the group or that play out in different ways with different impacts in that group. That's intracategorical work. Inter is where we're comparing across categories. So the kind of work that we do on health inequalities, for example, I'm talking numeric inequalities, not every inequality is an inequity and injustice, but we can look across large population databases and we can describe inequalities and outcomes across a lot of different cross-coded categories representing intersections of social categories. That kind of work is intercategorical, but it requires that we can measure something similarly across different groups. It requires that if we're talking about privilege, we can actually measure that or define that in a way that's comparable across different groups of people, and that's a very open question. And I'm going to give you an example from discrimination research of just a very clear case when it wasn't, where you can't measure. And that's the issue of gendered racial microaggressions. So as I said, racism is gendered. It plays out differently, but it also plays out different for different racial and ethnic groups. Racism is not the same. And the example I want to give you are 2 papers. And I love this because these are 2 teams, both in the United States. They're both doing a mixed method study where they're doing qualitative work, and then they're going to validate their new measure with quantitative analysis. They're both looking at gendered racial microaggressions in women. One is looking at Asian American women, and one is looking at Black American women. They both come up with 4 subscales. Do you see any overlap? No. Gendered racial microaggressions by teams using the same process in the same country at approximately the same time in groups of women produced non-overlapping results when you have 2 different racial groups for those women. Because the ways that racism is gendered are different for Black women and different for Asian women. So assumptions of or the strong Black woman stereotype, this is not going to apply to Asian women. Asian women are fetishized in a particular way as being passive, as being, in a way that Black women are not. Like they produce very different things. So this is an example of what I would call co-formation, and it's an example of two intra-categorical measures that suggest to us that we're not going to be able to do a lot of that inter-categorical comparative work on gendered racial microaggressions because we just might not be looking at the same thing in different groups of people. And if you want, it's a nice example because you could go do a search on gendered racial microaggressions. You'll find papers for Asian men. You'll find, you could find a lot of ones and they all look different. So I told you this was a new area of work and I don't know exactly where it fits in. I was just like, I'm frustrated and there's a whole big thing missing here and I need to think about that. That is honestly the genesis of this. So I'm going to end with questions. I know you're all supposed to ask questions, but I'm going to end with a bunch of questions, okay? So first I ask myself, to what extent is it possible to even measure privilege? If part of privilege is not understanding that you have privilege, if it's being treated fairly and not understanding that other people aren't, can you ask people? And in fact, as somebody who's developed measures of discrimination, I can tell you when we did the intersectional discrimination index measures for our day-to-day discrimination, we had a series of items in there on fair treatment that we dropped entirely from the final measure. It turns out white people in the US feel they're treated very unfairly. And it was almost like it was a separate measure from the ones that asked about actual concrete experiences. Has this happened to you? Those ones gave a really different picture than the ones that asked if you were treated unfairly. So, there's evidence that supports the fact that we can't ask people if they're treated fairly or unfairly because it's not going to produce something that matches onto that actual experience. How might privileges or stigmas or discriminations, how might they interact? And that can, how might they interact? I sometimes use the example of male privilege because it's something that people assume is fairly static or exists. But working in the United States, if you're Black or you're a person of color and you have visible intellectual or mental disability, and you're coming into contact with the police or in some kind of setting, is there a privilege to being male in that situation? There's not. Research shows that they're more likely to perceive you as stronger, more aggressive, or more of a risk to overreact. There's not male privilege in that context. It's not a privilege, it's not an advantage to be male. So even things that we tend to think of as fairly unitary, it's all contextual. So how do these interact? How does this work? How might privilege be relationally shaped in ways that require intra-categorical measures versus intercategorical measures? I was just talking about that. And ultimately, how does social privilege function in conjunction with other privileges and stigma discrimination to promote health or to harm health? How might these effects at different points in life impact well-being over the life course? We tend to think that having more privilege earlier in life is going to have protective effects later in life. But working within trans communities, people who transition, who've been straight white men publicly for most of their life, sometimes don't have the skills to deal with the marginalization they're going to experience as trans women. They haven't had to, and there's research that shows that a small amount of adversity in that way can be very good for you. You can develop skills, you can feel proud about yourself, you can feel connection to that until you hit a particular level of adversity that threatens to crush you, right? So it's not the case that being at an exclusively privileged position is going to necessarily be protective for everything along the life course either. So that's something I'd like to think more about, with more examples and try to figure that out. And how might studying privilege add to our understanding of health inequalities and to health inequity? I think that's the ultimate question. If we're missing something here, how would our picture of social causation of health inequity change if we were to take a more fulsome approach to incorporating privilege into the work that we do?